Man, it is moving quick. Let's read them. Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia. Written sanctuary cities for America. Beautiful. Mankind in Arizona. You're on the air. Thanks for holding.
Yes! Humanity is rising and is awake, Alex. No weapon formed against us shall prosper. Why? Because we pledge our lives.
Oh, but Greg Abbott's not perfect. It has nothing to do with him.
I know.
Ah!
Yeah. when someone starts yelling, the best thing you got to do is you just gotta. The perfect improv instinct is just to yell with them.
Yell with them. Like, you don't know why they're yelling. You just show. I mean, look. Michael Brooks always said Alex Jones is the most talented broadcaster of our generation, and I think that instinct. I mean, how many people would have done that?
I don't think I would have.
When you started yelling, I yelled, but I didn't take myself off of mute. So I think that shows the difference.
Same here.
I started thinking about like, it's like which of our, our commentators going to start saying like too loud. You blew out my eardrums. That's all losers mindset. Alex just started yelling.
No, exactly. Look, say what you want. The man is a natural showman. On the content of what he's talking about, and by the way, I'm Ben Burgess. This gives him an argument. We usually start that way instead of with screaming. I am joined as always by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. If you think about the content of what he was talking about just before and after the primal screams, it is kind of a weird reversal. So Alex Jones, for the longest time, was somebody who was a big part of his shtick was that he was concerned about surveillance, the Patriot Act, stuff like that, right? In fact, I'm old enough to remember a time that Alex Jones was much more left-coded, at least, than he is now. Richard Linklater gave him these little cameos where he's essentially playing himself in Waking Life and Scanner Darkly. And when, in those roles, when he's screaming about, civil liberties and corporations and stuff like that. He sounds crazy, but he sounds like a crazy leftist, basically. And it's a little unclear to me. I'm not going to claim sort of deep expertise in Alex Jones studies, but it's a little unclear to me how much his beliefs have actually changed and how much it is that just during the Bush era, he sort of put forward and emphasized the aspects of what he thought that were the most kind of amenable to an audience of people who basically didn't like Bush. And then later on, under Obama, and then especially, he kind of put forward more sort of right-friendly aspects of what he thought. And then, when Trump came along, he latched hard onto that, right? But at least some of it, right, has probably always been the same. I think some of the sort of stuff about the coming war between the angels and the demons and the lizard people who are really demons and all that stuff has probably been, fundamentally similar over his different incarnations. But stuff like this does make me wonder how much, he actually has adjusted, right, over the years, right? Because the kind of fundamental Alex Jones thing was always, stripping away the lizard people and whatnot, was always about distrust of state power. And here, as is kind of often true for Trump era and post-Trump era Alex Jones, he's all for state power, right? I mean, the sort of fundamental thing that they're talking about, right? This is this standoff that's been going on at the border in Texas, where the Border Patrol wants access to people who are trying to cross at places other than legal points of entry, so they can process them. So people who have asylum claims, can be heard. So people who are in danger of drowning in the Rio Grande don't. And the Texas National Guard has been trying to prevent that, right? That they've actually put up razor wire to stop, to keep people out at these points. And there has been this sort of what looks like this constitutional crisis, and that's certainly how a lot of people, including Alex, have taken it. Although he's all for it, right? Because it's the rebellion that he wants. About basically whether or not to allow the border patrol access. We could talk about the nuances of that legally, but like at its core, right? He wants the jackbooted government thugs to like put up razor wire and to do a better job of like rounding people up and deporting them and all that stuff. So, there is some interesting friction with kind of the old Alex Jones emphasis, as I think has been kind of clear for some time. I remember there was a Jacobin article from like 2015, 2016, after I think maybe the first time Trump went on Alex Jones's show, which is bizarre to remember that happened, where, I don't remember who wrote it, but I do remember the title, because this is back when Jacobin articles could have fun titles because everything hadn't been taken over by search engine optimization. It was called Smokey the Bear, the UN and Hitler. And in that article, whoever wrote this was pointing out, look, this is a guy who's been sounding the alarms forever about government surveillance. And there's a point in the interview where Trump was like, yeah, we need to have more surveillance at mosques. And Alex was like, yeah, right. So it's, it's confusing, right? But you definitely, whatever else you can say, and we're going to get into the actual underlying issue. I mean, whatever, like the guy, I don't know how much it matters what the proportions are of psychopath and grifter in Alex's soul, but stuff like this does make me wonder.
I think it's interesting, and I'm sure I'm not the first to note, but to think about people with anti-authoritarian politics that aren't really based in, let's say, like a class analysis, or at least a rigorous analysis of some kind, how often that just kind of drifts, right wing, or drifts in a way that isn't very anti-authoritarian at all. You know what I mean? It's just more of like some kind of expression of anger or rage or negation, without much of a positive, which I think, I feel like you really see this a lot with people that you're like, yeah, they just kind of started anti-authoritarian, like Tim Pool, right? Was like part of, like he was like a pro-Occupy guy, right? And then it goes into being like a pro-Trump guy, and there's this drift that I think is interesting, and you see it in people like Jones, and I feel like part of it is just not having a super coherent analysis at its base. And the other thing I was thinking is when you were saying that he's changed, but he's stayed the same on like lizard people and all that stuff. I was thinking, how Bill Maher's whole thing is like, I haven't changed. Like it's you guys that have changed. I want to see Alex Jones saying that about like, I still believe in the lizard people and angels and demons. You know what I mean? If you guys have changed, But yeah, I don't know.
I actually kind of want to see Alex Jones on Club Random.
Yes,
please. To see Alex Jones on Club Random. Although it might be a little dangerous because there's this component of explicit drinking on set in Club Random, and I kind of, I guess he would be doing that anyway, but like just letting him do it out in the open without having to like take like a suspicious number of bathroom breaks.
They seem to have very different reactions to alcohol if Alex Jones is really drinking, which is that you might have the sleepiest interviewer combined with the most energetic interviewee possible, which I think would be an amazing energy.
No, yeah, I mean, I'm down. I think it should.
By the way, I don't know if you've seen those memes, but of who should we have as the next season of True Detective? I think Bill Maher and Alex Jones as the two detectives in True Detective season 5 or whatever would be an amazing pairing.
Nice. To be honest, I only ever watched the first season of True Detective.
Same.
Yeah.
but to the policy concerns at hand, though.
Yeah, to the policy concerns. Okay, so I actually I do know a little bit more about this than I would have otherwise. Although I think Andy is probably the person here who's most well informed on this. We're going to go to him in a minute, but on last Friday I was going to go on Newsmax and debate one of the hosts there about a couple of things that have in the news, and one of them was going to be the Texas border standoff. So I kind of spent a lot of my Friday reading up on that, and then the segment ended up getting bumped because of breaking news. I don't know, it's Newsmax. Trump probably tweeted, and they had to spend an hour talking about how awesome and based it was. But in any case, so one thing that I do know here that's like, I mean, I think there are more interesting things to say than this, right? But just if anybody's curious about the actual legal aspect of what's going on here. So the thing that kind of seems like a constitutional crisis at a quick glance is that the Supreme Court, well, the way it's been widely reported is like, the Supreme Court ordered Governor Abbott to take down the razor wire, and he put in more razor wire, which just sounds like a level of constitutional crisis that we haven't had in a very long time, right? Like on the face of it. Now, there is an explanation for why it's not. It's really dumb, but I'll tell you what the loophole is that I think Abbott, understands himself to be using. The Supreme Court decision didn't say that they had to take down the razor wire. The Supreme Court ordered them, said that they weren't allowed to obstruct the Border Patrol from coming in to take down the razor wire. So technically speaking, just, you could have like a Border Patrol guy, walking around with a pair of scissors, cutting down razor wire, and a Texas National Guardsman behind him putting up more razor wire, and nobody would actually be violating the Supreme Court's order. I told you this was going to be stupid, but there you go. I think that's the loophole.
Like when you're not allowed to turn on lights on Shabbos.
Exactly.
I think you made this metaphor, this analogy, but
exactly.
So you have a Christian do it for you.
Yeah. It's like the guy in the black hat and the side locks who could if you have the Shabbos going there and say, it sure is dark in here, and you haven't technically told him to turn the lights on, so you're not violating the Shabbos restrictions. Okay, so that's the dumb part. As far as the underlying issue, and I mean, I guess we'll see what happens legally if the Supreme Court goes back and is like, no, we actually. Sorry, we should have been clearer. You got to stop putting it up. But in any case, as far as the underlying issue, there's a big, there has been this giant right-wing freak out in the last several months. I mean, really in the last several years, there's been kind of a rolling freak out, but there's been a particularly intense one in the last few months. On the right about the border and immigration and fentanyl, which is which they definitely wrap up in there in the sort of bundle of things that they're freaking out about. And this is something that I think if you're not following right-wing media, it's kind of easy to mostly miss, right? Because it's something that like mostly other people aren't talking that much about. But if you do, it's like all that they're talking about. Like I wrote an article for Jacobin. I briefly mentioned it last week, but we didn't really have time to get into it before Luke came on, called "The GOP is Melted Down," about immigration, where the most kind of striking stat that I saw that I cited at the beginning of that is that the word border has appeared more times in political ads since the beginning of the year than any other word, including endorse and message. Right? It's just like border, border, border all day, all night. And you know, I think there are a few different issues here. And, you know, for the sake of like actually saying something real about this and not just kind of making fun of Alex Jones and moving on, you know, it's worth disentangling them. So one is that it really is true that the system for processing asylum seekers is pretty overstrained right now, right? Like this is, you know, there's a big backlog. It takes forever. There's like, there's all kinds of, you know, even though the, you know, actual border enforcement is pretty clearly supposed to be federal, and we can get into the sort of asinine argument that Abbott is using to say that it's not, but, and the courts, right, for processing these people are certainly federal. There also really is an issue about like where the resources are coming from, to the extent that we have them at all, right, to kind of take care of people while they're waiting, you know, to be processed. That you know, this is why, right, that stunt where people like Abbott and DeSantis will ship asylum seekers to, you know, New York City or Chicago or wherever. You know, it's cruel and dumb. And I think if you're willing to like move people around the country to make this point, you know, you're kind of not quite taking them seriously as people. But the reason that that's an effective stunt is that like it works, right? Like the second it happens, there are lots of people in New York being like, oh my God, you know, we don't have the resources for this, you know, this is terrible. And they can turn around and be like, oh, see, this is what the border states have been, you know, have been going through, right? And so that's a real thing. There's also, you know, the fentanyl thing, you know, is a real thing, right? Most of the fentanyl in the U.S. right now is produced in Mexico, and that obviously has had, you know, devastating effects. And the last thing that I point to that is like a real thing, even if the solution is, you know, the solutions of the right ones are incredibly cruel and stupid, is that, you know, look, there are lots of people who disappear into the underground economy after, you know, after crossing over and making asylum claims, right? Like that happens. There's the, you know, there's a stat that like 90% of people who claim asylum do show up for their hearing, right? But it's also, that leaves 10% who don't. That's also the first hearing. There's a question about like, okay, but then like how many people show up once it's been denied? And, you know, and I think it is true, right, that it's like for a variety of reasons, under the table employment isn't great. Labor laws are good, right? So, and I also think, right, if we're going to be completely honest about this, the combination of capitalism and the nation state system does create some pretty ugly trade-offs when it comes to, you know, supply and demand in the labor market and how that plays out with wages and everything else. And, you know, I'm not totally sure what I think the right solution to all of that is. If I could just snap my fingers and, you know, make it be so, you know, obviously I'd like global, you know, fully automated luxury communism, and would certainly have open borders as part of that deal, right? Because you know, why should your freedom of movement depend on, you know, where you've been coming from? But if we're thinking about like the order of operations, right? Like, okay, what do we want to happen given how much else is the same, right? I think there are some genuinely hard questions there from my perspective. All that said, I think that the right-wing freak out about this is the point of the Jackman article, is kind of peak pseudo-populism, because even when it comes to the real things that they're zeroing in on, this doesn't really address them, right? So so just a couple of quick examples of that. The fentanyl thing, yep. Seems to be the case, right? That right now, vast majority of fentanyl in the U.S. is coming from Mexico, but all of these Republicans, including Trump, Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley, who want to send the U.S. military to Mexico to shoot and bomb and defeat the drug cartels militarily, which is what they've been talking about, right, for months. Above and beyond being fucking insane on its merits, right? You really want to start a war with Mexico, and I know they'd say, "Oh, we don't want to start a war with Mexico. We just want to go in and fight the cartels." But it's I don't know what the Mexican army is doing in this scenario, while the U.S. army is bombing and shooting people on Mexican territory. And also, even if we pretend that this was going to be completely effective in its stated purpose, I think the idea that drying up this particular source, it's I don't know, a few years ago, Mexico wasn't the main source of fentanyl, right? Presumably if Mexico-based cartels were completely taken out of the game, somebody else would step up to grab up that market share, right? That's how that works. And it's the idea that the problem is the supply really seems to me it fundamentally misses the point, right? The problem is the demand, that, you have deindustrialization, atomization, social hopelessness, right? That leads people into this in the first place, right? What, if the demand exists, I think the supply is gonna follow. So similarly, when you talk about undocumented workers, dragging down wages, I'm not going to deny that there, in some industries there's truth to that, but I also find it a bit ridiculous that the people who talk the most about this never want to seem to do anything that would more directly prop up wage levels, say raising the minimum wage, or making it easier to form unions. And so it's the one and only thing they're willing to do, supposedly for the sake of wages, is to round up and deport, desperate people who, are mostly nonviolent and just kind of trying to live their own lives and provide for their families, right? That seems pretty grotesque to me. I guess my last thing about this before I go to Andy is just one more thing on the legal point, that the really ridiculous part of the Abbott legal argument is that, it's okay to use the state National Guard for this. We're not usurping federal authority, because there's a line in the Constitution about using militias or whatever to repel invasions. And, it's look, right-wingers always claim to be originalists or textualists about the Constitution. We know what the original meaning of invasion is, and it's not unarmed people crossing the border without authorization to look for jobs, right? That's not what the word invasion means when it appears in the Constitution. In fact, we even have James Madison on record on this, because it came up during the debate about the Alien and Sedition Act. He's yeah, that's not what invasion means. And in fact, I'd also point out that for the first several decades of the United States, we essentially had open borders anyway. So, I think the legal argument is completely ridiculous. And, I think you could argue about the extent to which there are real problems being talked about here, and then what would kind of count as, legitimate or better solutions. But this is just kind of vintage Trump era Republican stuff, which is to say that it's loud and flashy, and there are bits and pieces of truth being weaponized to support it, but it's just kind of incredibly barbaric when the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely. One of the big things is that first of all, why there's immigration in the first place is a lot of it has to do with our foreign policy in Mexico, South America, Central America, and all that stuff. And until if you really want to address that, we need to start addressing what those issues. I know Kamala just spent millions of dollars to find the answers to it. It's like, come on, we know what the answers are. We know what the problems are, and what you're doing isn't helping. But she that was like her big thing, and it was a terrible idea because it didn't help at all, and it made things worse because what it did do is it empowered the cartels. So because that's now who you need to hire. Like before, you didn't have to hire a coyote to get you across the border, but now you kind of have to. And unfortunately, like anytime they do that, like trying to strengthen the border or whatnot, they're basically in a roundabout way empowering the cartels, which is not a good thing. So all their plans right now are not going along with what they're doing is not going to do what they think it's going to do. And it's been like that for years. I mean, probably the best argument to go into Mexico and invade was during the Civil War when the Border Patrol was initially founded. That the part of the reason why is there were like a Pancho Villa would actually cross into Texas and invade, and that was part of not the entirety. I mean, there's a lot of reasons about the Border Patrol, but that was one of the reasons. Nobody has written a book about the founder, but Mahente, which is a book I've not read, it does outline and it's been like cited in all these other books I've read. But it does do a great job, going over the history of it, how like a lot of the original members of the KKK, and the fact that like even Frank W. Berkshire, the founder of Border Patrol, who was a horrible, horrible human being, he actually had a lot more compassion for immigrants than what we see today, which is astounding. He was the guy who was in charge of the boat that deported Emma Gold's what's her name?
Emma Goldman.
Yes, Emma Goldman. He was part of that Soviet ark that he was actually in charge of the boat for that. Like not a good person, and yet he has more compassion. Like I found articles where he's talking about like we have the most advanced washing machines and we have new clothes for immigrants and we're giving them medicine as they cross the border. And it's like that was 1920 people. That was 100 years ago, and they're this guy who's surrounded by members of the Ku Klux Klan is doing a better job than we are now.
Yeah, so this is something when you and I were talking about this the other day that you were emphasizing, because I kind of made the point about how something that seems like just on a common sense level, it's got to be part of any sort of real solution to this is like having some like much more real federal level, resources for, giving people a place to stay and, things like that, while you process their asylum claims. And something you told me in that conversation was that this is something that we actually used to have much more of.
Yeah. And it's astounding. I know in the graphics, I put up the article that it's not really worth reading, but it's for the sakes of this conversation, but it is absolutely worth checking out. If you want to do a little research on this. Like I said, I found this, all immigrants will be washed. It's talking about like how great of a situation they have. These buildings and that they have and clothings and, like top of the line 1920s technology, they're able to do this, so why in, 100 years in the future, we're having a similar problem because, granted, it's not the Mexican Civil War that's causing this migration. It's reactions to our own, our own excesses across, the continent.
Right. That makes sense to me. The super chat from Strom: could decline in immigration cause a crisis in profitability in the imperial metropoles? Haste the collapse of capitalism. Yeah, look, I think lots of things could cause crisis in profitability, but the collapse of capitalism part, I think historically has been proven to be a lot harder.
Yeah, and we've been seeing a decline in immigration, and we're not seeing a collapse of capitalism. So
yeah, I mean, the real problem is that crises can happen for lots of reasons, but the result of the crisis being socialism is something that I think would happen under much more specific circumstances where you have an organized working class. There's mass socialist political parties, etc. We don't really have any of that yet, which actually brings us to the next thing we wanted to talk about. I should say, by the way, because I forgot to mention this earlier, so it says all this in the description, but originally tonight we're going to show a debate between me and Christopher Rufo. That debate is happening, but it didn't happen today. We were going to pre-record it just before the show, and we couldn't do that because of essentially an equipment problem at the studio, which is the same reason why you can see I'm not in the studio right now. If you're watching this on YouTube, that is that's my bookshelf behind me, and I think you can maybe see the bar card in the corner there somewhere. They might be being covered up by my name. In any case, I think we're actually going to record the interview tomorrow and play it as part of the episode either next Monday or the Monday after. Still trying to figure that out. But, we'll probably release it for like patrons right away, right? Advance access. So that is coming up. But instead, at the hour, we're going to be joined by good friend Nathan J. Robinson, who's going to be joining us to break down Bret Stephens' terrible article in the New York Times attempting to rebut the South African genocide case against Israel on Gaza. So that's coming up, and then I think we're actually just not going to do a post game tonight. So we love you guys, the patrons. We will make it up to you. But in any case, before Nathan comes on, though, right? The other thing I wanted to talk about was the election, and I went on Wednesday. So this is the day after. This is the day after the New Hampshire primary. I went on Novara Media, which is like a big British leftist channel. I don't know. Let's see. Like Ash Sarkar, the woman who was like, there's like a famous incident several years back where she was arguing with Piers Morgan, and Piers, I think, said something about liberals, and she said, "I'm literally a communist, you idiot." That person is on there. Aaron Bastani, people like that. Not that those are who I'm talking to here, but that's what the channel is. So we're going to watch the first part of that interview. I'm also obviously I also had to do that from home because that was in the morning my time, since it's like early evening in Britain. So there's a lot of my cat in this one. Like he kept trying to get on the keyboard while I was talking. But in any case, let's watch the first part of the Novara interview.
Donald Trump has won a second Republican presidential primary, this time in New Hampshire, and it's a record-breaking victory for the former president, making him the only Republican candidate to ever win the first two contests of the race to be the party's presidential nominee. Trump took around 55% of the vote in New Hampshire. His closest contender was Nikki Haley, who had hoped for a win in the more moderate state, but trailed nearly 12 points behind Trump with 43%. In New Hampshire, voters who aren't registered with any party, as well as registered Republicans, are allowed to vote. And as a sizable portion of Haley's vote came from independents. So that means that the count doesn't necessarily even reflect how unpopular she is with many signed up Republicans, right? So this was the race that should have gone pretty well for Nikki Haley, and it hasn't gone well enough. However, despite the loss, Haley has vowed to continue to fight for the nomination. That's a fact that seemed to annoy Donald Trump, who used his speech to give Haley this warning about the Democrats.
These are very dishonest people, and you're always fighting them. And just a little note to Nikki. She's not going to win. She's not going to win. But if she did, she would be under investigation by those people in 15 minutes. And I could tell you 5 reasons why already. Not big reasons. A little stuff that she doesn't want to talk about. But she will be under investigation within minutes.
A little stuff that she doesn't want to talk about. Very interesting way of campaigning. I'm joined now by Ben Burgess, host of Give Them an Argument and a columnist at Jacobin. Great to have you on. Ben, is the nomination now in the bag for Donald Trump?
I think it is in the bag because for some of the reasons you just said, New Hampshire was by far the best state for Nikki Haley. Certainly much better than Iowa, certainly much better than her home state of South Carolina, which is about to come up. And if you look at how badly she did there and how badly she did there in parts of the state where you would have expected her to do better, it's really very unclear what possible path she could have, except just kind of hoping that Donald Trump has a heart attack or goes to prison in time.
So that was the other theory I'd heard, that maybe she sort of had given up on sort of winning the primary in an ordinary way, but really wanted to stay in the race in case something came up. As you say, Donald Trump has a stroke or ends up having some sort of legal worry that means he can no longer stand. And if she's still in the race at the point of the Republican National Convention, then she can sort of be anointed the candidate. Do you find that plausible at all? I know you're not Donald Trump's doctor, so it'll be difficult for you to sort of comment on that side of the equation. But do you think there is anything that could possibly stop Donald Trump now?
Certainly getting arrested a bunch of times isn't going to do it, because we've been there and it didn't do it, right? Like, the man has 91 indictments and he's still kicking. So that's not going to be it. I'm not his doctor, but I do note that he seems to be a very old man who's already had COVID pretty badly. He was hospitalized in 2020 and who seems to have a diet of mostly fast food. So maybe it's not impossible that that option could come to pass.
And what kind of campaign is Donald Trump running? Now, I have to say, everything I say is on YouTube forever. So when I get sort of predictions wrong, they're there to, for everyone to see. But I remember having a conversation with Aaron Bastani last year where I was sort of saying, I can't see this going too well for Donald Trump in the presidential election, because all he talks about now is an election being stolen and his court cases. When he stood in 2016, he was talking about, I disagreed with the issues he was talking about, immigration, building a wall, elites. But they were issues that sort of the general public care about. And it has seemed that sort of since 2020, he spent a lot of time talking about, pretty niche issues that most people don't believe, i.e. the election was stolen, or that most people don't care about, his sort of, beef with the courts in various states. But that doesn't seem to have come to pass. I mean, he does seem to have sort of some message discipline where he is talking about, the country and issues that voters might care about. Am I correct now, even if I was wrong last year?
I think so. So I think Trump is pretty good at figuring out what people will like it if he talks about, and sort of steering towards that. Whatever he might or might not believe, to whatever extent you think Donald Trump has beliefs, and the way that we normally understand that. But for example, in New Hampshire, he ran ads about how Nikki Haley wanted to cut Social Security. Right, he actually did one of those on MSNBC, maybe in an attempt to cut into Democratic crossover votes for Haley. And he did say things like that back in 2016, that that he wasn't going to touch entitlements. That, of course, as president, he actually did. He tried to cut Medicaid, and in many ways just governed like a very normal Wall Street Reaganite, kind of a Republican. But I think that he is fully capable of counting on people having short memories about all of that, or maybe not having tracked those details at the time that it was happening. And also he's running against Joe Biden, who's only slightly older than him, but seems much older than him. And he does have quite a bit to work with, right? I think that, I think between anxieties about what's going on with foreign policy, Ukraine, and the economy, inflation. Like I do think that a lot could happen, of course, in the next several months between now and the general election. But I don't find it impossible to imagine Trump, pivoted to more of a winning message, stopping, whining about his court cases and the allegedly stolen election all the time, which probably plays better to Republican primary voters, the general election voters, and pulling it out, right? I mean, like, we keep being told that, oh, well, there's forever until November, anything could change, and that's still true, but also there's a lot less time between now and then than there was when we started being told that.
I like that. I thought you were going to go into sort of Kamala Harris, the passage of time. The great thing about time is that it moves forward, not backwards. You kept it more concise than she usually does. Let's move on to Joe Biden. Stay with us, Ben. We've got a couple of clips, because while Trump was winning his New Hampshire primary, Joe Biden was in Virginia speaking at a rally on abortion rights, and that's when this happened.
How many kids have you killed in Gaza? How many women have you killed in Gaza?
You too. What? You're with me. I know you're with me. I'm not saying anything. Let's go. Okay, you gotta let women press their legs.
So that scene, we've seen it before, of someone sort of chanting about Gaza and then everyone sort of saying 4 more years, which to me seems a little bit distasteful. But that was just one of multiple interruptions that took place during Biden's speech. And those protests may be representative of more widespread disquiet concerning Biden's position on Palestine, especially among younger Democrats. Now, Michigan is a state that swung from Trump to Biden in 2020. And the day before the protest we just showed you, a CBS reporter asked a number of Democrats in that state how they planned to vote later this year. Here's what one said.
Saba, you said reproductive rights are a huge factor for you, but that you probably won't vote for President Biden.
I think it would be hypocritical of me to use reproductive rights as a way to justify voting for Biden when Biden is aiding and sending military aid to Israel, which is airstriking Gaza and blocking humanitarian aid, leading to women there who are pregnant, either getting C-sections without anesthesia, not being able to be provided with prenatal care.
I've seen this sort of blowing up on US Twitter. Lots of people sort of on the left saying we're not going to vote for Joe Biden because of Gaza. Then lots of centrists who are saying that's ridiculous. The only person, well, they don't say this, but the argument is, even if Joe Biden's bad, Donald Trump might be worse. Donald Trump, of course, I think would probably just sort of say, pressure. I can imagine him sort of pressuring Egypt to take a bunch of people from Gaza and then sort of like really pressuring people to accept something along the line of the Abraham Accords. He did have that sort of deal of the century, didn't he? He's not going to be a friend of Palestinian rights. But can you talk about that? And I suppose there's 2 questions here, isn't there? So one is, will this impact the election, or is this sort of more about discourse than it is about, votes on the day? And then 2, where do you stand on this sort of question of how people outraged at Biden's position and approach to Gaza, how should they vote when it comes around to the elections?
Yeah, so we're going to get into this in a minute. We're going to finish watching the interview, and then we'll talk about essentially that question that he just asked. But I did want to note, for anybody who's thinking, okay, look, this is really bad, we might be all be pissed off about it, but ultimately this won't actually affect that many people's votes when push comes to shove. Maybe. But anybody inclined to say that, I do just want to emphasize that from the top levels of the Democratic Party, the messaging on this has been, well, let's watch the clip of Nancy Pelosi.
They're in front of my house all the time. So I have a feeling for what feelings they have. But we have to think about what we're doing. And what we have to do is try to stop the suffering in Gaza. This is women and children, people who don't have a place to go. So let's address that. But for them to call for a ceasefire is Mr. Putin's message. Mr. Putin's message. Make no mistake, this is directly connected to what he would like to see. Same thing with Ukraine. It's about Putin's message. I think some of these protesters are spontaneous and organic and sincere. Some, I think, are connected to Russia. And I say that having looked at this for a long time now. As
you think some of these protests are Russian plants?
These are plants. I think some financing should be investigated. And I want to ask the FBI to investigate that.
Yeah, so let's be real clear on what we just watched here, because if you're in a situation where a substantial chunk of your voters are pissed at you, and at least as a snapshot of like late January 2024, that's definitely true. I mean, you can look at polls, voters 18 to 29, is a huge drop off of support for Biden. There's just an article about all these black pastors who would normally be doing get out the vote stuff, or like, we're not sure we can do that, given, what's going on right now in Gaza. So, you do have a problem with a substantial chunk of your base. And so you think, okay, how are you going to put these fears to rest? How are you going to get these people back on your side? And I think calling them Russian agents and saying that you're going to ask the FBI to investigate them might not do the trick.
It always makes me feel broke too, when it's like, these guys, they're all rich, they're all making money. You're like, I'm out here doing this shit for free. I mean, it's kind of it's kind of,
yeah, you haven't gotten your rubles yet.
Yeah, it's kind of an insulting gaslighting message too, because it's like, it's kind of the stakes of it not being true, it makes it such a deeply fucked up and evil claim that is trying to get you to question your sense of reality, where I think that me and most people that I know who have vaguely similar politics feel this way about the Israel-Palestine conflict. But no, when I go out there, like the 10 people that I might know at the protest are real people, but all of the other thousands of people, there's scores of them are paid. It's just like she's basically saying that you it's like a conspiracy theory. That's
and it's also like, what exactly is it that you think that requires Russian funding? Like I have yet to see a Gaza protest that has anything fancier than some like placards with like stuff written on them, and I guess bullhorns, but like I really don't think those are that expensive.
No, they're not. I used to work at Radio Shack, and I can tell you that they're you can get one for a few for like $30.
And I think that this question from Robin Hobgoblin Wells is also why would Putin care about Gaza? I'm not saying he wouldn't, but I just think that I love how she throws
probably
it out.
not
Like,
much, right?
That's Putin's message. I'm like obviously Ukraine, there's a pretty one-to-one thing going on there, but Gaza,
I mean, as dumb as it is, I at least understand the theory with Ukraine. With Gaza, the connection is less clear. Like, it's like, yeah, sure. I mean, by and large, Russia has been, like signaling the opposite of the U.S. on all these like conflicts around the world, because the U.S. is deeply involved in a war against Russia and Ukraine, so of course they are, right? But like, outside of that context, you're right. I mean, like, why on earth would Putin give a shit about this one way or the other? I mean, he's always been more than willing to do business with Israel.
I mean, I think Nancy Pelosi remembers Vietnam, and like the lessons from Vietnam are not being learned, because it's really simple. Like yes, the crazies did blame the Russians for the Vietnam War protesters, but Johnson was smart enough to do like really good domestic things to make people forget about his terrible war crimes overseas.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I think that the terrible war crimes overseas kind of came later in a lot of cases.
Yes, but it's still lied to us into a war over in Vietnam.
Yeah. And I mean, in fact, I think that there's some pretty good evidence that that Vietnam kind of blocked a lot of the good things that were otherwise coming down the pipe, because they were like I mean, there are actually people from the Johnson administration who said like, yeah, like Medicare for seniors was like the first step, right? But then like we were going to like roll out, like essentially like Medicare for kids and like, that like, but like they were spending so much money in Vietnam and it was taking up so much attention that, that didn't end up happening, which, might be some maybe lessons there too. But yeah, so I think given this, there is a real problem here, and the strategic genius of Pelosi and co. isn't helping. So let's watch the second part of that interview. Yeah, so it is worth saying, like you kind of gestured at there, that Trump was very, very bad on this as president. The whole point of the Abraham Accord, besides building an alliance against Iran, was to do a version of diplomatic normalization between Israel and the Arab states that froze out the Palestinians, so the occupation could just continue forever, and that wasn't considered to be an outstanding issue. Interfering with that normalization, he moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, which is something that that all of these past well-known peace Nixon advocates of Palestinian rights like Nixon and Reagan and George W. Bush had never done, because that would be sort of U.S. sign-off on Israel's illegal annexation of Palestinian East Jerusalem. He did everything Netanyahu wanted at all times, right? So Trump was god awful about this, and I think it's reasonable to think that he would even be a little bit worse. But the problem with that argument, you mentioned my home state of Michigan, which has this extremely large Arab American population, and as much as I think there is a harm reduction case for voting for Biden despite everything, and you could even reasonably surmise that Trump would be even worse on the ongoing, slaughter and, ethnic cleansing, ultimately, it looks like, in Gaza, than Biden is. That is an awfully hard argument to make to people who may, in some cases, actually have like cousins who have been killed in the last few months. That, oh, I'm sorry that the president helped kill your family, but Trump would have done even more so. I mean, it's just very, very difficult to make that argument. As much as there is there is a rational case for it, right? So I mean, if I were still living in Michigan, which is a swing state, I live in California. It does not matter at all how I vote. There's zero chance of Donald Trump winning the state's electoral votes. But if I still lived in Michigan, I might suck it up and vote for him anyway, on the basis of that argument. I might be able to get myself there by the time that November happens. But I think that the sort of centrist argument that, oh, it's just ridiculous, it's just silly, that people won't vote for Biden or can, seriously consider not voting for Biden is, I think, kind of tone deaf at best. And at worst, maybe reminds me a little bit of that Bertolt Brecht poem about how maybe the government should dissolve the people and elect another. I mean, if you don't have, it's the job of politicians to appeal to voters, and if there is this much of a mountain of disgust and revulsion that they have to climb over to vote for you, right? That's not a defect in them, right? You need to be doing something different.
It's very depressing, the whole situation, really, isn't it? Finally, I suppose, in the UK, I think everyone's sort of just looking at this in disbelief. I can't believe this sort of failed state is going to elect Donald Trump again, is sort of the attitude. Looking at sort of elite opinion in the United States, it seems like there's a bit of a move to sort of come round to the idea of a second Donald Trump term, not in the sense that sort of people are actively supporting him in sort of the American elite, but they're sort of saying, maybe it's not going to be that bad. So I'm thinking of Jamie Dimon. So he's the chairman of JP Morgan Chase. He was in Davos very recently sort of saying, you know what, Donald Trump wasn't that bad. He got some things right. Are we sort of seeing a process now where, the business elite in America, and I suppose many people in America, are sort of just saying, okay, Trump, very likely it's going to happen again, or at least, it's a coin cost as to whether that will happen again. We're going to have to get used to it and sort of accommodate ourselves to that possibility.
Yeah, I think a lot of them probably are. I mean, this is, look, people like that, by and large, did very well in the first Trump presidency. That as much as during 2016, many of them worried that he would be too chaotic and destabilizing. And I think those worries definitely resurfaced at the tail end of his presidency, and especially with Stop the Steal and the January 6th riot. It's when you actually had like the Chamber of Commerce at one point calling for the Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office in his his final weeks in office. The fact remains that overall, nothing much happened that was bad for those people during Trump's 4 years in office. That he posted a lot of crazy things on Twitter. He certainly tried to and at some point succeeded in doing some very awful and performatively cruel things to immigrant families, to people coming in from Muslim countries. But by and large, in the bulk of how he governed in pretty much the way that Mitt Romney would have if he had been elected president in 2012. It was a 4-year orgy of tax cuts and deregulation, union busting. And of course, all those people are going to like that. Right. And so I think that it's maybe not that surprising that they've come around a little bit, that they would prefer somebody who seemed more normal and less chaotic. But there's also a limit to which they're actually willing to sort of go all out to stop this from happening, because we already saw it. It already happened for 4 years. And we know how it went, and we know that it was good for them. And I guess maybe the last thing I would say about this is just, yeah, okay, Donald Trump is a particularly sort of luridly repulsive conservative in his mode of presentation. But there is a question about how different he really is when push comes to shove from the Ron DeSantis's, the Nikki Haley's of the world, and which is bad enough, right? From my perspective, right? I think all of those people are awful, but it does make me wonder when I hear things about, the U.S. from a British perspective being a failed state that would elect this guy. It's like, I don't know. I mean, the Tories have been in power there for how long?
Yeah, I mean, I can't be too smug. I apologize. You've got me there. Ben Burge, it's been great to have you on. Thank you to you and your cat for joining us this evening. I know this is going to be a very long and grueling campaign, so I'm sure we'll have you back on again soon.
Yeah, it's funny actually, since we had to do tonight's from home too. As we're playing this, the cat's curled up in the chair next to me, and he's being totally chill right now. But he spent the entire Novara interview trying to get on the keyboard. In any case, though, I did want to talk before we go to the Bret Stephens discussion. Just kind of do a few minutes of wrapping up the conversation about the election. We do have Nathan on backstage. I don't know if he said whether he wanted to come on for this part or not. Yeah. Okay. Let's bring Nathan on.
Might as well. Otherwise, I just be
editor.
hanging around in the green room.
Well, you don't like the cheeses we laid out?
I love the cheeses, but I like all y'all more.
Oh, that's touching.
Thank you.
Yeah, is confusingly also in the current affairs office in New Orleans. I believe, although honestly, I have also been inside his house. That could be either one.
This is current affairs headquarters.
Okay.
This is the new current affairs headquarters that we moved to a couple months ago.
Nice. So yeah, I think that question that he kind of asked toward the end about people who weren't going to vote for Biden, because of Gaza and, you know, and whether I thought that was going to be a factor and what I thought people should do. You know, I don't think I said anything that sort of strikes me as wrong looking back on it, you know, but I do think that the point wasn't really that fully explored. And so maybe it is worth just kind of taking a minute now to like really, you know, kind of explicitly, you know, wrestle with it, since, you know, the point that I was making in the interview was that, look, if lots of people are disgusted by your actions, they don't want to vote for you, right? That's a you problem, right? That's something that's not a problem with the voters. That's a problem with you, and you should do better. Like, that's certainly true, right? But there is this other question about, given that you know, given that Biden is going to continue most likely to pursue this kind of monstrous foreign policy, what that means about what the rest of us should do or think. And yeah, I didn't really grapple with that or attempt to grapple with that too much in the answer. And I did just want to kind of spend a minute on it here. So one of the things that was making me think of this, even after we recorded that interview, is on Breaking Points on Sundays. They do this thing. They do these like mini episodes where they answer audience questions. And one of them was about this. And I wanted to just play this. This is like about a minute long. So this is Crystal Ball being asked about a debate that she had about the election, about, you know, essentially Biden and voting for Biden and all that with Brianna Joy Gray back in, I don't know, a few months ago or something. I forget. It all blurs together. We actually did a breakdown of it on the show at the time. And at the time, you know, I mean, I and Victor and Ethan, who were doing the breakdown with me, we all very much agreed with Crystal's point, right? In that. But, you know, I think she does say some interestingly reflective things about this. So let's watch the clip from Crystal.
Question, Patrick Lance, what do we got? Crystal versus Bree. Crystal, revisiting the debate that you had with Brianna Joy Gray, if that conversation had occurred today, would you still back Biden as strongly as you did? Are you reevaluating your position, or do you believe that the domestic wins are still substantial enough to outweigh his support of Israel?
I would not make the case. Wow. Certainly as vociferously as I did at this point.
Do us a favor, don't clip this. Maybe we can clip it ourselves and let this go viral. Anyway, go ahead.
Listen, I mean, all the arguments still stand. Like, if you're looking at the domestic record, if you care about unions and the antitrust movement, like, it's very clear Biden is better on those issues. But I certainly cannot, in good faith, look at any person in this country and tell them you should vote for a man who is supporting a genocide, shipping the bombs, unconditional support. Like, it's just too far. I personally, at this point, don't know what I will do in November. But like I said, to actively, like, it's one thing to say, listen, you do whatever your conscience tells you. It's another to actively make the case for someone. At that point, I was willing to actively make the case for this man. No.
Yeah, and I mean, that does definitely capture something, you know, I've been thinking about, although there's a lot here that I think rides on the question of what exactly you mean by actively making the case, right? Making the case for what exactly. So in 2020, I actually talked about this a lot when the show was first starting, because it was, you know, the show started, you know, very shortly before the 2020 election. So there was actually, you know, at the end of the fifth episode we ever did, season 1, episode 5, I did this kind of monologue about the election. And, you know, I said a lot of the things that I always said about this, which is that I've always thought that, like, scolding people for how they're planning to vote was stupid and counterproductive, and, you know, etc. Right. But I did ultimately end up making a sort of case, although a very unenthusiastic one. So I think we have just a minute from that. Crucially, the thing that I think strategically matters the most is about organized labor, because if we don't have an organized working class at the base, any attempt at socialist politics is ultimately going to be shouting into the wind. And Trump is going to continue to appoint Republicans to the National Labor Relations Board and to the courts, whose mission in life, their goal, what makes them get up in the morning is trying to wipe out unions and end collective bargaining in the United States, certainly the public sector. And Biden is certainly no friend of labor, but he's going to appoint Democrats to those things, where possible. And the Democratic strategy for managing capitalism is just a little bit different. It assumes a framework in which public sector unions continue to exist and collect dues. And that might be an unexciting thing to say from a certain point of view, but strategically, I think it's something that matters. So I think rather than seeing the question as being which one of these reactionary scumbags should be awarded the gift of our support, we should think of it like if you've ever watched the horror comedy Cabin in the Woods, in that movie, there's a scene where people are in the basement, and even though they don't realize this is what they're doing, they have to pick which monster they're going to fight by picking out the totem that belongs to them. Right? Is it going to be the cannibalistic redneck zombies? Is it going to be, the Cthulhu, squid horror? What's it going to be? And I think that's the situation that we're in. We're in the basement of the cabin in the woods. We don't get to support a candidate who would actually represent, even in a modest social democratic way, the agenda that we want. Some of us tried real hard to bring that about, campaigning for Bernie Sanders, but we lost. And so we don't have the option of supporting an agenda that we actually like. We could make a purely symbolic gesture of voting third party. I think that's fine in most states. But my advice, if asked, for people in swing states would be to do what I'm planning to do, which is basically in that cabin in the woods basement. I don't know what the Biden totem would be, maybe Corn Pop's rusty switchblade, but pick that, right? That's the enemy that you want to fight for the next 4 years. The rotten, despicable neoliberal Democrat, not the increasingly authoritarian, extreme right-wing demagogue. I think strategically that's the best move. Your mileage may differ. Yeah, so that's not exactly I love Joe Biden and you should too. But it is a argument for tactical voting in swing states. And I guess where my head is at, rewatching that now and thinking about this now in light of the interviewer's question, in light of some of what Crystal was expressing, is like, everything I say that argument does still make sense to me, even if it's a little bit harder to have much fire in your belly for making it, as Joe Biden is literally aided and assisted in genocide. But those are my thoughts. I would be very curious to hear from everybody else, maybe starting with Nathan.
It comes down to which enemy do you want, since we're not going to be in power. Although there's another element to this that I've been thinking about. I mean, to a certain extent, I agree, which is that if we just take the genocide issue, we can put a certain. It feels pretty hopeless because we haven't affected the Biden administration's policy, but Biden is susceptible to at least some, in theory, if we were able to build a movement to pressure him. The idea would be that the Biden Democratic Party responds to pressure on this issue in the way that the Republicans, who have absolutely no interest in what anybody has to say about human rights in Gaza, would not. So Trump would always be worse. I've been thinking about one more thing, though, which is that I have noticed I'm not an accelerationist. I'm not a person who believes it's better to have Trump just so that we can make it, get the fight started sooner. But I do feel, and you've probably noticed, that Biden's administration has actually had a really kind of demoralizing effect for the left. It's really, there's a lot of liberals who went back to brunch, who, if Trump had been in power, would be fighting. I feel like a lot of people who would have been opposing what the United States government is doing in sending weapons unrestricted to Israel are defending it because it's Joe Biden doing it. And so you have a lot of people, a lot of Democrats who defend things that they would actually oppose if Donald Trump was in power. And that's something where I do feel like, certainly I know that as someone who runs a left institution, we had a lot more robust readership under Donald Trump, and I know that the DSA was doing a lot better under Donald Trump than they're doing under Joe Biden, because in some ways having Trump in power, if he doesn't accomplish that much of what he wants to do, it certainly fires people's anger in a way that having Biden doesn't. And so there is something where I almost wish we had a more monstrous enemy because it'd be easier to get people to fight against them.
Yeah, I think there is some truth to that, although it's interesting to look back and kind of see that it's, like there was actually quite a bit of left stuff going on in like in the later Obama years, right? Right. Occupy Wall Street, the first Bernie campaign, right, when he won 22 states. There was actually, I think maybe even on immigration more than people often remember, that was going on then. There were these like giant like Mayday like immigration things that were happening. But yeah, it's tricky because I think that under Trump, like DSA exploded, all that happened. Everybody was reading Jacobin current affairs, and it's, much better for people who do what we do for a living, but like, I also feel like that was a pretty specific combination of circumstances that led to that, right? Which is that there was both this sort of extreme alarm about Trump winning, and it's almost hard to remember looking back on it how much of a crisis that seemed like the first time. And there was also this like near miss with Bernie. There was this sense that it's like, oh, there's this other thing that actually probably would have been, effective in defeating Trump, and Bernie would have won, and that was, that promised this sort of better direction for the future. And we have this sort of proof of concept. It almost happened, right? And I think that made a lot of more people excited about sort of signing the combination of those two. I think made a lot of people excited about signing on to this project, whereas now I think you just kind of have a lot of ambient demoralization, and a lot of people who might have drifted a little bit more towards the left, just becoming regular liberals again. And I don't know, right, what would happen with those people if Trump is reelected. I actually think there's a very good chance we're going to find out.
We're going to find out.
Yeah, things continue as present, right? We'll find out one way or the other. But that sort of core argument that I was making in 2020 about labor does seem right? It's like that the point is not that Joe Biden is like has that like Joe Biden is like playing Solidarity Forever at night when he goes to sleep or anything like that. He crushed the rail strike, right? But it is that Democrats and Republicans do have different strategies for managing capitalism. I think that's just true. And and I think the NLRB stuff actually does make a lot of difference. Like that's something, I think there are a lot of internet leftists who are sort of very dismissive of the idea that it makes a lot of difference. I don't think there are a lot of union organizers who aren't clear on why it makes a difference, right? Who's been appointed to the National Labor Relations Board and, gets to adjudicate, cases and all that stuff.
Well, wait a second though. We know that union density hit another record low last year. So if it makes a difference, why hasn't it made a difference?
Well, I mean, I think that's a long-term trend, but also, I think that there was like way more strike activity, last year than there was the year before, right? Both of those things are true, right? It hasn't resulted in higher union density yet. So Yeah, I mean, I think that and certainly like if you look at the decisions themselves, right? Like they have been much more favorable. I think that's true. I mean, my biggest thing is just, I think that like everything I would have said about this in 2020, I more or less think I don't think that it's healthy to sort of think of this as like my identity is bound up with who I'm voting for. I think that you should sort of treat it as like which monster you want to spend the next few years fighting with. Cause like there's no, and I think it's like probably a mistake to moralize too much one way or the other with what decisions people make with the awful choices that our ridiculous half democratic system leaves them at the ballot box. And, it's probably best to handle it pragmatically if you live in a swing state. But also, God, I'm so happy right now that I don't have to actually take this advice because I live in California. It doesn't matter.
I live in Louisiana. It doesn't matter.
I think on the topic of the lesser evil voting stuff, though, I guess from my perspective, there's a lot of different elements to it. I think that what Kristen was saying in terms of like actively make a case. I think that once you get to the question beyond voting, like, am I going to knock doors? Am I going to argue with my friends? Am I going to publicly promote? Very different question, right? But in terms of like, what am I going to do in the privacy of the voting booth? I haven't ever heard a argument that I found very compelling against just a very, very brute utilitarianism. Tim Pool aside, with this debate with Sam Cedar. But I guess like, if I had to vote between, I've heard some of them, but if I was going to vote, like, let's make it really, really stupid, right? Like a candidate that would lead to, 20,000 people dying versus a candidate that would lead to 30,000 people dying. I don't really, the argument that I shouldn't vote for the option, since those are my only two options, that 20,000 people instead of 30,000 people die, it's not something that I'm bounding, like you said, I'm not bounding my identity to it. I guess, there's other counter argument. The counter arguments are like, maybe by throwing my support against the to 20,000 people die cause, I'm not giving them an incentive to change, right? Or I'm giving legitimacy to that cause. I guess I understand those arguments, but for me, just to pull the lever for the slightly worse thing, no matter how bad the two things are, it's not very compelling to me that I should do anything different. Now, when it comes to should I go out and knock doors for the 20,000 people die cause, I don't know. I mean, realistically, if we're going to give it to Biden, who I do think, at least if you're not an accelerationist, I think it's better for the left. I think to have Biden than Trump, at least domestically, probably internationally too. Just from a standpoint of personal effort, I'm just not going to spend any time trying to get him elected, even if I thought that was like on some technical level. Even if I thought like on some technical level, maybe the thing I should be doing right now is just knocking on doors for Joe Biden. But I just wouldn't do it, because it just would feel disgusting to me. So that's to me a different question. But I don't, I am trying my best to be a tool. Is what I'm trying to do. I actually retract my argument because that logic, I just got logically dunked on.
Yeah, and as you can see from his T-shirt, it says Stanley right on it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Some people have drawn opposite conclusions from thinking about levers and how many people are going to die. We have Tim Pool who said this.
We tend to see villainous people as those who are willing to sacrifice people for the sake of other people. We tend to see heroes as those who are willing to save the individual. Sam didn't know what those words meant.
Sure.
But they're hugely important to our policy in this country. The trolley problem, as it were, is a question about whether you're willing to kill a person to save 5 people. These are questions of deontology versus utilitarianism. Sam doesn't know those words. And I'm not saying it to be mean to him. It's not what I'm not everybody knows philosophy. But if I'm trying to convey ideas, the only thing I can do is try to find common ground between us. Big movie just came out, Avengers.
He knows philosophy. Yeah, I would just for fun, by the way, the original trolley problem is most people have like a utilitarian reaction to should you pull a lever to divert a train from a track where it's going to kill 5 people in a track, it's only going to kill 1 person. But they have a very unutilitarian reaction if you change the example to like, you can stop the train and save the 5 people by pushing a guy off the bridge. And so the question is sort of how to reconcile those two, right? Is there a way to make those consistent? Should you just decide you were mistaken, one time or the other? So it's very unclear to me how that maps on to the voting question. But yeah, look, I don't, I am, I think the biggest thing for me is just that I think that it's, I think it is important to recognize that by the time you're actually in the booth, there's nothing that you could do that's going to make the left have like won, right? Like if you're faced with a choice between a Republican and a centrist Democrat, that means the left lost already. And so the question is just how to sort of minimize the damage of that loss. I think there are a lot of reasons why that, might be more difficult for some people to make that calculation now, understandably, ranging from the like extreme horrors going on in Gaza to the fact that, the Democrats essentially canceled the vote where the left could have actually had a chance at, at challenging Biden this year. And, I guess like, I guess the question is how you're going to address the, the person who won't, right? And like I said, I think I could make this argument in the abstract, but it's also very easy for me. I have my coastal privilege, and I will most likely, vote for Brother West if he's on the ballot, or if he's not, I don't know, PSL, right in ceasefire, something along those lines. But yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna like wag my finger at somebody who just can't bring themselves to, right? Like I think that it's, I think that there's like a sort of, somebody asks me for my tactical advice, I'll give it, but it's like, I don't, I'm not going to be the guy who's like, oh, you should, you just shouldn't be that mad about it. Right. Like, because I honestly think they should be that mad about it. And it's, ultimately, I think just, if enough people can't bring themselves to that Trump wins, that's not a good outcome. But I mean, I do think that it's important to sort of remember that the primary person whose fault that is Joe Biden.
Real quick, I do think that if you live in a swing state and you're interviewed on national television, you should say that I was all ready to vote for Joe until he started backing a genocide. And
yeah. Now you should probably say that whether it's true or not.
Yeah, I support what she did for sure.
That's an important point, which is this far out of the election. It's pretty important to make, to the extent that we can affect the Biden administration's policies at all. It's actually, I mean, I almost feel like we should put off all the discussions about whether you should vote for Joe Biden, because right now what we should be saying is nobody should be voting for Joe Biden because of the genocide. Right now, that's what we should say, is because they need to look at it and they need to panic. Because if they're looking at it and going, we'll lose, a few people here and there. But if they look at it and they go, oh, we are headed for a catastrophic loss if we don't fix this immediately. And if people are shouting at him at every event that he goes to, and if his approval rating is dropping to 0 and his status in the polls is dropping to 39% or whatever, that's good. Right now.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. Although flawless transition incoming, who's not?
Who's not, Ben?
You know what? I think this answer is best given in the form of video.
You're in the wrong business if you can't take a little baby bedbug tap. You don't belong, offering your commentary. People, you have these keyboard warriors that are naked in their basement that just firing out one shot after another. Take it.
Well, I think if that's the worst thing that he's been called, my goodness, take a look at my Twitter feed any day. I welcome being called a bedbug.
The fact that you read it is even worse, though.
No, other people will share it with me.
You deactivated your Twitter account after a controversy that involved someone calling you a name. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm going to be careful with my words because I know these are going to be examined carefully. So I think Twitter brings out the worst in its users. It tends to bring out the worst in its users. And yesterday, a professor at George Washington University described me as a bedbug or a metaphorical bedbug, just in the context of the New York Times having a bedbug problem in our building. And I think that kind of rhetoric is dehumanizing and totally unacceptable, no matter where it comes from.
Is that the worst thing that you have ever been called on social media?
There's a bad history of being called, of being analogized to insects that goes back to a lot of totalitarian regimes in the past.
Well, I would welcome the opportunity for you to come to my home, meet my wife and kids, talk to us a few minutes, and then call me a bedbug to my face.
The president went on to slam Stevens, saying he's now quitting Twitter after being called a bedbug, mocking him as a tough guy.
I'd forgotten all about this.
Just one bedbug clip.
Glad you reminded me.
Yeah, the show
follow
art,
him
if you'll
for
notice, the show art has a bedbug on it.
Yeah.
How did you forget? I think that was like probably one of the biggest.
Because I'm interested in the play of ideas.
Oh, okay.
Not name calling on social media.
Yeah,
These flaps.
It was a big scandal that really made a big difference in my life.
Yeah, and I mean, I really like that first one with Sean Spicer, like first sort of reasonably mocking Bret Stephens for freaking out they've been called a bedbug, and then had it. He's like, "Oh, why do you read what people call you on Twitter?" And then he like pretends that he doesn't. He's like, "Oh, I don't. People tell me." Right? Like other people read the tweets. They tell me what I'm being called. But it is really worth emphasizing that the guy on the bed singing was singing the actual email that Bret Stephens sent to the professor who had called him a bedbug on Twitter. An email, by the way, that he copied to that guy's provost in an apparent attempt to get some workplace discipline. For having called Bret Stephens a bedbug, which is the kind of thing they do in totalitarian regimes. They call you a bedbug.
I just watched Zone of Interest. I don't remember anybody being called a bedbug in that.
Now, what I would think they do in totalitarian regimes is commit genocide against some of the people who live there, this is indeed what South Africa has accused Israel of doing at the International Court of Justice. We are, I think Heidi Matthews is coming on later this week to like break down that ruling a little bit, because the ICJ, they didn't immediately grant all South Africa's requests, which was kind of the way it was spun in Western media as like the main takeaway, but they did make a preliminary ruling in their favor. They said that Israel, had a obligation, that there was a danger of genocide, that Israel had an obligation to take steps, to come back from the brink of that, crack down on genocidal incitement, etc. But Bret Stephens thinks his position is that there is just that there's just nothing to this, that this is absurd. He has this article in the New York Times called "The Genocide Charge Against Israel is a Moral Obscenity," and and this is, I think this is pretty striking, and this is worth going through just because there are so few attempts to actually rebut the merits of the charge. And the ones that exist, as we'll see with the Bret Stephens case, are pretty half-hearted. There's also Alan Dershowitz also did one in Compact, which I wrote about for the Daily Beast. That, so there have been a few of these, but like most people don't respond to the merits at all, right? Even
I wouldn't call this an attempt to rebut, because I don't think that anywhere in this article does he discuss. I mean, I'm looking through it again. It's about 700 words long. Does he discuss the arguments made by South Africa or the evidence presented by South Africa? So I don't even think this counts as an attempt to rebut the case put forth by South Africa.
Yeah, he does a little bit here and there. Most of what he does isn't particularly accurate. Anybody who wants to can actually read the South African filing for themselves. It's 84 pages long. And it's pretty detailed, and the vast majority of what it says is not addressed here, right, whatsoever. But I do want to go through what he does say, right? This is kind of the version of the no genocide to see here that's being marketed to the libs, essentially, right? That it's been put in the New York Times, right? This is supposed to be the kind of respectable version to make people pause in the middle of drinking their lattes and think, oh, maybe he has a point. So let's just kind of go through this reading series style. He starts out with a paragraph of whataboutism. He says, in recent decades, as many as 3 million people perished in a famine in North Korea that was mainly government-induced. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians were gas bombed, starved, and tortured to death by the Assad regime. An estimated 14 million were forced to flee their homes. China has put more than 1 million Uyghurs through gulag-like re-education, a thinly veiled attempt to suppress and erase their religious and cultural identity. But North Korea, Syria, and China have never been charged with genocide at the International Court of Justice. Israel has. How curious. And how obscene. So just like initial thought about this, if you somebody, if a murderer is arrested and their defense is that there are several other people who got away with murder that they know of, that doesn't really seem like much of a defense.
Not to a charge of now, there is a point there, which is it could prove that the justice system is unfair, right? I mean, if you can point to the fact that that several people have committed the same crime and you're the only person who's been prosecuted, and there's some clear reason why you've been singled out. But if you committed the crime, it doesn't hold up as a defense in court against the charge. And obviously, this is the classic case of what is called whataboutism, which is where you just don't address the merits of the argument being made. You just go, well, look at these other things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and when you're debating, if you spent time debating Zionists, or if they know you go to protest, they say why, it's maybe even more ridiculous in those cases, but they often, because they have the same talking points that they run through. And what I think, and then one of them is like, why aren't you out there debating China? Which is, I think that's this point, as bad as it is maybe slightly better than that one, but it is one. Or the other one is like, well, what about like Egypt's role and what's going on? You know what I mean? And then I'm just like, all right, Like, I'm not saying I'm an expert in that, but that seems bad too, man. Like, what do you what do you want? You know, so I mean, they're just not the main driver of the conflict, but it's like they're just trying to get me to say, like, why am I obsessed with Israel over all these other bad things?
Well, I mean, the Egypt thing is also particularly ridiculous because, yeah, Egypt is run by a military dictatorship that's backed by the United States with massive amounts of foreign aid, which are to a great extent a payment for siding with the U.S. and Israel and stuff like this.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what I looked into after someone said that to me, and I found that out.
Yeah, and you know, really, like, the sort of darkly funny thing is that up until a couple of weeks ago, when the U.S. started bombing the Houthis, when people would try to do this kind of whataboutism, they would often be like, "Oh, why weren't you protested? You know, when Saudi Arabia was bombing Yemen," which is like a little bit funny because actually there was quite a bit of left-wing activity about that. You know, there was a whole war powers resolution spearheaded by Bernie Sanders to try to stop, U.S. involvement in Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. But also, it just seems like the takeaway, at best, should be, yes, these are some other terrible things that there should probably be more protest about. Okay. That, that doesn't tell me that there should be less, that like, oh, Israel should get a mulligan for genocide, and, that they because other people haven't been criticized as much. And, I mean, it's funny. I actually wrote an article for Current Affairs, actually, a couple of years ago, called "Is Whataboutism Always a Bad Thing?" And, my point there is that, the sort of mere making of analogies and sort of thinking through, okay, what if it were us, whatever, stuff like that, is often sort of framed as whataboutism in a bad way. And that, like, oftentimes sort of thinking about role reversals, thinking about analogies to, between, what other countries have done that we're being asked to sort of support intervention to stop, and what the U.S. has done, is often helpful for making sure that we're applying consistent standards. But the question is always, okay, but, like, what are the right consistent standards? And so if it's, I mean, these cases are not all on the same level, but if it's, if it's countries X, Y, and Z have committed terrible crimes, and, let's say, for the sake of argument, that's like God in less opposition than Israel, then one adds, even if there's a real inconsistency there, you can always resolve the inconsistency in multiple directions, right? You can either be less upset about Israel, right? You could say, oh yeah, and it's all fine. All of these things are fine, or none of them are fine, right? Those are both ways to resolve it. And I think the real issue is going to be, okay, well, have you given us any reason to think that they're all fine, right? Like, and I haven't, I haven't heard one here. It seems like, it seems to me like, none of this is okay. And, if the United States had been, doing emergency shipments of guns and weapons, and money to Assad, Syria, to make sure that they didn't run out of barrel bombs while they were committing these atrocities, that would have been bad, and people should have protested.
Also, like, North Korea and Syria don't seem like they're part of, like, the conversation of, like, what Western, first world, or whatever, like, term you want to call, like, the lumping of, like, Europe and America and Israel and maybe a few other places in with, Syria is a close ally to Russia, if I remember correctly. And
for sure,
North Korea has, like, ties with nobody. China is, like, painted as, like, as a bad guy for everybody. So, like, it's not, like this is supposed to be, like, the world's, everybody's supposed to like Israel. Like, that's what the media keeps telling us, is that Israel is our friend.
And certainly the, if you're an American citizen, I mean, it's kind of the first commandment of Noam Chomsky, right? That you have the, your sort of primary focus should be on the crimes that are being committed by your country, because if you have any sort of influence at all, it's going to be on that, and not on crimes that are being committed by enemies of your country. And And in this case, we are talking about crimes that are being committed by the United States. I mean, this is not the United States is at every level facilitating this, and the weapons are being manufactured here. Money is coming from here. The United States is providing diplomatic cover. The United States is bombing Yemen to try to break the Houthi, naval blockade on Israel, right? So this is ours, right? Like if the United States started actively supporting crimes that were being committed by North Korea, that would be bad, but that also hasn't happened.
Well, yes. I mean, that would explain why Americans should pay attention. I assume a defender of Israel would say, okay, well, that's why you as Americans pay attention. But what about South Africa? Why would South Africa bring this case against Israel? To which I think one of the clear answers is this is actually the worst thing that is happening in the world right now. Right? He says, like, in recent decades, there was famine in North Korea. Like, right now, if you look at the obliteration of Gaza, the deaths, we know that more children are dying than what was it, in a couple of months than in all of the conflict zones in the world in all of last year put together. Right? In Gaza in just a couple of months, the obliteration of infrastructure in Gaza has been on the level of Dresden in World War II. I mean, separate from the unique obligation that people in the United States have, there's also a reason why people who do not have the same kind of unique obligation still should put this highest in their priority, because it's the worst thing that is happening in the world right now. There is a human-caused famine unfolding in which millions of people are on the brink of starving to death.
Yeah, absolutely. It's obscene because it politicizes our understanding of genocide, fatally eroding the moral power of the term. You just start calling every time that 1.9 out of 2.3 million of the people who live in an area are driven from their homes, and 90% of them are going days without food, and half of them are on the brink of starving to death. You just start calling all of those genocide, and obviously those are just things that are going to happen. So genocide isn't a big deal anymore. The war between Israel and Hamas is terrible, as is every war. But if this is genocide, what words do we have for the killing fields in Cambodia, Stalin's Holodomor in Ukraine, the Holocaust itself? Words that come to mean much more than originally intended eventually come to mean almost nothing at all. A victory for future genocide heirs who'd like the world to think that there's no moral or legal difference between one kind of killing and another. So as you just addressed, Nathan, the as is every war is really understates how bad this is right now. That like late last year, almost the end of the year, I think, it was announced with great fanfare that the civilian casualties from the war in Ukraine had reached 10,000, which is I mean, and I think by then it was already about 20,000 in Gaza, which of course the population of which is a tiny fraction of the population of Ukraine. The civilian deaths in Gaza were much more than the civilian deaths in all of Iraq in 2003, for example. Again, vastly bigger population in Iraq, right? So war is hell, I think, really understates. I mean, even like Russia in Ukraine has been widely and correctly criticized for indiscriminate bombing, right? And if they haven't, even in absolute terms, never mind proportionally. I mean, proportionally, it's not even in the same conversation, right? Even in absolute terms, they haven't inflicted anything like this much civilian death, even while doing indiscriminate bombing and wild violation of the laws of war. But then the other thing that hits me about all this is the reference to Stalin, because the Holodomor in Ukraine, right? Is one of the things he's listed as a clear example, right? Well, what are we talking about there, right? Because there's no, there were no death camps and gas chambers in Ukraine. What we were talking about was an engineered famine, right? That there's I know historical debate about how much like actual crop failure sort of played a role in starting it, but that they were like actually, that they were like that they seemed to be on purpose, prolonging it. That food, food was actually being moved out of Ukraine, sold on the foreign market to buy heavy machinery, etc. Right? So if you're purposely letting people starve to death, that's one of the things that Bret Stephens thinks is a clear example of genocide if it's happening in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
But of course, somehow it doesn't when it's happening in Gaza. It's obscene because it perverts the definition of genocide, which is precise, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, notice two key features of the definition. It speaks of acts, whereas part of the genocide case against Israel involves the misinterpretation of quotes from Israeli officials who have vowed Hamas's extermination, not the elimination of Palestinians, and it uses the term as such, meaning the acts are genocide only if they're directed at Palestinians as Palestinians, not as members of Hamas, or heartbreakingly as collateral deaths in attempts to destroy Hamas. So Nathan, I know you've actually read the entire South African case. Is it being accurately described here?
I think this is this kind of passage where I really feel like it's quite clear that once you're a New York Times opinion columnist, the editor doesn't even ask you questions, like the most basic questions about your argument. So he says, acts committed with the intent to genocide. He said, but it's about acts. Yes, acts with intent. Why did they put a bunch of quotes in? The quotes are there to prove part of the case that involves the intent. The quotes, here's where he really does not make any attempt to engage with the actual filing that South Africa made, which was widely commended among legal experts for the way that it satisfied every part. What they did was they put in a bunch of quotes from high-ranking Israeli officials that proved the genocidal intent. All these quotes about how there's not going to be any food or water in Gaza, we need to have disease in Gaza, we're going to fight Amalek, all of this stuff to show genocidal intent. And then they showed all of the acts, and then they linked the acts to the intent. And so he's just being wildly dishonest here by saying, they gave all these quotes. In fact, there was a two-part structure. Here's all the stuff they said that shows they wanted to destroy the population of Gaza. And here's all the things they're now doing to destroy the population of Gaza.
Yeah. And just the absolutely. And also, it's really worth underlining that Stephens is just kind of lying about what the quotes say, right? Like you're right. He's also misrepresenting what they're doing in the argument, right? That it's not that South Africa is talking about statements instead of acts. They're talking about acts, and they're also talking about statements to prove the intent behind the acts. But he's also badly misrepresenting what a lot of the statements are, right? Because the statements don't just talk about going after Hamas. The statements, you have people like Isaac Herzog, who's the ceremonial head of state, is the president of Israel, who said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. You have you have people in you have Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, the ultimate decision maker in all of this, who compared Hamas to Amalek, which is an apparent reference to a passage in the Bible about destroying Amalek with not just the fighting, not just the soldiers, but also the women, children, and suckling babes. You have this long, I think it takes up like 12 pages of the 84 pages of South Africa's filing is just all these quotes, and a lot of the quotes really are about, oh, the goal should be to just not have most of the Palestinians living in Gaza live there anymore, right? That the goal should be mass removal of Palestinians from Gaza. If there's disease in Gaza, that's good because that's going to help us do this. We should want there to be pandemics in Gaza, that it's good for there to be food, hunger in Gaza, right? Because that's going to break people's resistance. That's going to, that's going to make them, more willing to resettle. And if you are trying to, if you are committing mass killing of a ethnic group with the intention of making the survivors leave the country, right? That is textbook genocide, according to the statute that Bret Stephens is quoted part of here.
And Bret Stephens is not even quoting the entire definition of genocide. Like he's got part of it, but it's any of the following acts, including killing members of a group, causing seriously bodily harm or mental harm of the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group of conditions of calculated life to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group from one group to another.
Yeah. Which certainly covers the many statements advocating mass relocation to Sinai. And we was talking about tragic collateral damage. I mean, it really is worth emphasizing here that 2.3 million people live in Gaza. 1.9 million have been dispossessed from their homes. Right. This is 1.9 out of 2.3 million people. I think it might actually be more than that at that point, but that was the number that was being thrown around for a long time. Who have been driven out of their homes by the Israeli campaign. There has been this systematic destruction of like really all aspects of life in Gaza. Like they did a controlled demolition of the last university, right? That was still in Gaza, right? So that it's not even like, oh, we were trying to bomb the Hamas command center in front of it, and the university just got in our way.
It's just, now they're having a big conference on the resettlement of Gaza, right? All the plans for all the colonies they're going to, for all the new Jewish colonies they're going to found in Gaza. They're making the plans. All the Israeli real estate developers are doing little renderings of the new beach condos that are coming.
Yeah, this is this conference on like restarting the settlements that were evacuated from Gaza in 2005 and founding more settlements and all of that was attended by several members of the cabinet. That's the game that's been played more or less continuously since the beginning of October is, well, those aren't important cabinet members.
That's an argument I hear. This drives me crazy that anyone believes it. It's like, can you imagine it in this country if we were to say, well, okay, that sounded genocidal, but that's just the Secretary of State. Well, okay, that's genocidal, but that's just the Secretary of Defense. Okay, well, that's just the Minister of the Interior. And like, and we had all these genocidal remarks, and then Joe Biden only made like borderline genocidal remarks. You go, I mean, this administration seems to be genocide. Oh, no. You can't count what the Secretary of Defense says. I mean, and I hear this all the time.
Yeah, and we are talking like, Ben Gvir, the actual Ministry of Defense, is one of these like unimportant cabinet members. The National Security Minister, Yoav Gallant. These are the people we keep being told, sort of don't really count because even though they're high-ranking members of the government, right? They have these really important cabinet portfolios. They're like the right-wing edge of the coalition. So so that doesn't tell you anything. Okay, so I don't know that we need to go through the rest of this, but I do want to at least do, because it has, as it continues, it goes right back into whataboutism now about Hamas, which is I mean, again, if you imagine like lawyers representing Slobodan Milosevic when he was at The Hague, making the argument that like Croatian forces were also committing war crimes, that just would not be relevant to the validity of the charges that Milosevic himself was facing. But before he gets into all that, right, Stevens does make one more argument. He says, if Israel were, and you hear this one all the time, if Israel were trying to commit genocide, it wouldn't be putting its soldiers at risk or allowing humanitarian relief to arrive from Egypt or withdrawing many of its forces from Gaza. It would simply be killing Palestinians everywhere in vastly greater numbers as Germans kill Jews or Hutus kill Tutsis.
No. I mean, they're only admitting humanitarian aid under great pressure, right? So that part of it doesn't really work at all. Which is to say that it's quite clear that they would prefer not to let anything in.
Yeah, I mean, when the war started, the unimportant defense minister announced what he called a total blockade, which he explicitly said meant no food, no medicine. And they have not been letting much in. I mean, there is extreme hunger going on in Gaza right now, and this kind of argument that like you hear a lot is like, oh well, if it were real genocide, right, be killing even more, and it is a little bit, I don't know if funny is the right word, but I mean, given that we are seeing killing in extreme numbers, like way beyond Russia and Ukraine, way beyond the U.S. and Iraq, right? That this sort of, this hypothetical number that would be even higher is what they'd really be doing if they wanted to kill as many Palestinians as possible. But I mean, there is a sense in which, look, I mean, Israel could just nuke Gaza, right? I suppose, but like, yeah, you were saying, Nathan?
No, well, first off, they can't, because there are constraints there are outer limits on what Israel can do. And it often seems like they're trying to inflict as much as they could do, given the constraints of the fact that, they do have to maintain the arms pipeline of the United States.
Well, this is what I was going to say, right? Because it seems like the leap that's always going on in this argument is between, okay, if the only goal they were worried about was killing as many people as possible, then sure, they could nuke Gaza, they could set up gas chambers. But say that's like, okay, that's not the only goal that they have to worry about. Is it the same as saying that there isn't a goal of inflicting as much damage on the population of Gaza as they think they could possibly get away with, which is like already really stretching what anybody thought they would do?
The other thing is, genocide does not have to be an attempt to destroy the entire population. It could be to destroy a part of the population. It could be to, as Netanyahu himself has been quoted as saying, to thin out the population. It actually seems like they have a pretty calculated genocidal plan, which is, well, okay, we're going to kill a lot of people, right? And we're going to create a humanitarian disaster. And then we're going to try and drive as many of the rest out as possible. It's a pragmatic genocide, right? It's like, okay, well, we'll slaughter a lot of them. We'll create a total famine-ridden, disease-ridden hellhole. And then we're actually going to pose as their saviors and say, well, we want to resettle these refugees. And look, they want to leave, and let's find them new homes.
Yeah. No, exactly, and even Netanyahu has made statements about talking to various countries to see if they'll take in Gaza Palestinians, and there are again many unimportant members of his cabinet who have been very explicit about that as the end game, right? So that even the piece. I mean, Andy's right; he didn't quote the whole thing, but even the piece of the UN definition of genocide that Stevens quotes says in whole or in part, right? So it's not that you have to even attempt to kill every single one, right? If you're just inflicting mass murder against a national or ethnic group with the intention of reducing the overall population of that group, with the intention of inducing the survivors to accept relocation to another country, that is exactly the kind of thing that definition is meant to cover.
I do want to also get to my favorite part. I really wanted to cover my favorite part of this Bret Stephens article because it's the part that almost put a smile on my face with how I mean it's deeply amusing because he goes to what I call the Hiroshima defense.
Yes.
After this, which is, well, if you think this is bad, the United States, let me tell you, in World War II, slaughtered German and Japanese civilians on an immense scale, and it was far more indiscriminate. But we don't accuse the United States of committing genocidal acts against civilians. And the reason I find this deeply amusing is that the United States obviously has never reckoned with its own record of horrible racist atrocities against the Japanese in World War II.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's also not funny, but some sort of funny that so many of these defenses of what Netanyahu's doing in Gaza end up going back to World War II. In other words, end up going back to the last big bombing campaign that was carried out before the current laws of war were codified in the Second Geneva Convention, right? So
specifically to make sure that nothing so horrible could ever happen again.
Exactly, right? So, if you're trying to make a case that what Israel is doing is consistent with international law, saying, oh, look at the stuff that we did before we had this international law codified is not really doing what
Yeah, but even taking that, right, trying to, I'm saying, doing what they did to try to stop, the Axis powers versus trying to stop Hamas. I mean, that is kind of a ridiculous comparison, and what and the scale of what they were fighting and the power of the force that they were fighting against, right? So I just mean not to endorse what they did, but it's kind of a ridiculous analogy in the first place, I feel like.
Yeah, no, I mean that's certainly true. That I mean Hamas, was capable of killing several hundred Israeli civilians and taking a couple of hundred hostages, but they're certainly not capable of rolling through Israel even, right? Never mind world conquest. That's killing millions of people, anything like that. That's all true, but it's also specifically Dresden, never mind Hiroshima, are things that are today widely recognized as very severe war crimes. I mean, this is certainly by legal scholars and experts, also just by any normal person who read Slaughterhouse-Five. So I think that I think that saying, oh, this is just like that, it again doesn't make the point that people think that they're trying to make. I mean, really what it's a version of is what we always do, right? This is like the only way as Americans we seem to be capable of processing anything that ever happens in the world, which is to compare it in some way to World War II, right? That everything has to be World War II. So, if you are a big supporter of Biden's policy in Ukraine, then Putin is Hitler, and the Ukrainians are the allies of World War II. If you're some kind of tanky weirdo who loves Putin, then you start talking about Ukrainian Nazis all the time, and they're Hitler, and the Russians are the allies in World War II. Certainly, if you go through the history of U.S. interventions abroad in my lifetime, every single one that I remember involves some sort of Hitler analogy being trotted out. Saddam Hussein was obviously Hitler. Milosevic was Hitler. There was the Taliban, Nazis. I'm old enough to remember when Manuel
They're
Noriega
super
was
Hitler. Yeah, lots of Hitlers.
There's so
the
many
world full
Hitlers.
of Hitlers.
Yeah. I don't know. I just think maybe we want to raise the bar on Hitler. Hitler worked long and hard to become the symbol of evil in the world, and you don't want to just give that out like it's nothing.
Yeah, I think Stevens was making that same case earlier. Like, you don't want to keep calling people Hitler because it ruins the. Yeah.
Well, actually, because what Israel is doing is not on the scale of Hitler, that means that it's not genocide and it's not that bad. Basically, an argument made earlier, right?
Which is like also, but it's also crazy because if you say, if you say that something's not identical to the most notorious instance of a category, therefore it's not in that category, right? Like, so like nothing, nothing's an aggressive war if it's not as bad as what the Nazis did in Poland. Like it's.
Yeah. There's also something that's just bizarre about going like, man, if you think this is a genocide, this isn't a genocide. If we wanted to do a genocide, we could really do a genocide, or like, I only killed 2 people. So, I only had this racist mass murder was only 1,000 people, or only 2,000 people instead of 500,000 people. So it's just totally bizarre way to argue.
It's like the Crocodile Dundee argument. That's not genocide. This is a genocide.
This is.
Yeah. Nobody gives Jeffrey Dahmer credit for all the brains he did need. I mean, this is like clearly the Convention on Genocide was written with the intention of casting a wider net than just things that were exactly the same as the Nazi Holocaust. Again, in whole or in part, the way that intention is unpacked there, right? That there is a broader category of which this was the worst example that they meant to to include. And I mean, in a certain sense, arguing about whether these extremely severe war crimes fall under this exact definition is sort of, if you call it a genocide, it's still pretty bad. But also, it does seem to me, as Nathan said earlier, that the South Africans made a pretty exhaustive case, and it does seem awfully revealing that other than the like few lines of this where Bret Stephens at least tried to say something about that case, nobody else, seems to have read it, or if they have read it, they just, if all you could do is constant whataboutism, constant insinuations of anti-Semitism, that sort of war is hell hand waving, and you're ignoring the actual evidence systematically laid out in this 84-page legal argument, that doesn't give me much reason to think you actually have much of a counter argument. But we are going to have to leave it there, I think, for tonight. So thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us. Everybody should be reading Nathan at Current Affairs and everywhere else. That is the new issue. Yeah, I think
there's an issue, and also we just published a new Current Affairs book this week, which is our book for babies. This is the Current Affairs book for babies, introducing them to the universe and explaining what being alive is, and try going through politics, history, the nature of time, gender politics. So we thought that every newborn infant needs a basic sort of explainer, and that Current Affairs was in a good position to do that. So this is called Welcome to This Strange Thing Called Life, Introducing New Humans to the Universe. So that's our new book just out this week from Current Affairs.
Nice. I was actually also thinking that since we are quite likely about to start a new Trump administration, we'll see what happens in the next 9 months. But right now it seems quite likely I keep thinking now, now's really the time I should read Nathan's book about Trump. It's about to become possibly horribly relevant again.
I will be reissuing that in a revised and expanded edition before the election.
Nice. Well, definitely have to have you on to talk about it. So on that note, good night, sleep tight, don't let the Bret Stephens bite. Left effect.